Good morning, Facebook Live. My name is Kara-Leah, coming to you live from Auckland. Yes, I'm in my car because I have better 4G than I do Wi-Fi at my house. Today I want to talk to you about, I just want to tell a few stories actually. Yesterday I was online on stuff and I was reading this really big, long, in-depth article called Through the Maze. It's like 4 or 5 chapters, and this long article, you can find it on stuff, was all about mental health care in New Zealand, like charting the history of it from like the 1890s when it was very much institution-based, and then 1980s, 1990s when most of those institutions were closed down. And there's lots of different people's stories, etc. And reading that article Through the Maze got me thinking last night about my experience of recovery from psychosis, from a diagnosis of bipolar. And I just thought I'd tell a few stories around that. I was also thinking about, being a yoga teacher. And I became a yoga teacher in 2006, which was kind of before the yoga teacher training programs really kicked off in New Zealand. And And the interesting thing about that, so I'd had these psychotic episodes, or what it looked like psychotic episodes in 2004 in Canada. And they were awakenings, Kundalini Awakening. And so when I came back to New Zealand, I was really committed to my yoga practice because I just knew that the practice of yoga was crucial for my recovery from these experiences. And I knew that the more I was able to anchor myself in the witness, the more that I was able to disidentify with my thoughts, with my feelings, and the more that I was able to be embodied, that I just knew it would make my recovery like so much easier. And so I was dedicated to my yoga practice, and I was also on the hunt for a yoga teacher. And I was living down in Queenstown, and I went to a few different yoga classes, but didn't really find anyone who understood Kundalini Awakening, I didn't really even find any yoga teachers that understood presence from what I could see necessarily. But I still found teachers to work with. So I was going to classes, and it was helping, it was useful. So I turned up to class one day, and it's at the gym, Queenstown gym. There was only 3 of us in the class, and the yoga teacher got stuck in traffic or something, and she didn't show up. And so I said to the other 2 people, because I'd been practicing yoga at home for a while, for at least 2-3 years, I was like, well, I can take you guys through the sequence that I do, which was basically a power yoga sequence from the Beryl Bender Birch books. So I did that, and it was fine. There was only 3 of us, right? So it was pretty easy. And then about, a month or 2 months later, the gym owner, she approached me and she was like, hey, so Anna's pregnant and she's taking maternity leave. Would you like her yoga class? And I was like, I don't know how to teach yoga. Like, I haven't been trained. But she was like, yeah, but you were great the other day. You know what you're doing. You're a natural born teacher. Just take over the class. And so I did. And I was really nervous about it in terms of not my ability to teach, but the integrity of it, because I hadn't been trained. And at the same time, 2006, I was a wreck. I had been applying for jobs, but I felt like a total failure. I was really fragile. I was incredibly vulnerable. I'd had these experiences of psychosis. My reality had been completely cracked open. I had seen things and experienced things that it felt like nobody else had seen and experienced. And nobody was asking me to do anything else. I had landed a job as a bar manager at a really swanky bar, but I only lasted like 3 or 4 months because I couldn't handle drunk people anymore. I just couldn't be around them. And yet hospitality was kind of the thing that I had done mostly, hospitality and writing, when I was overseas. So it was like, I can't do hospitality anymore. I don't feel qualified to do anything else. My resume is like, here I am, I'm 30 years old and I've got nothing on my resume, because I've just been partying my ass off overseas for the last 8 years. I've written a bunch of freelance articles and I'd won a screenwriting award, but I was also a mess, So it was a really challenging time for me because I needed a job to earn money, but I was also, I was stuck, I couldn't really go and do a career thing because I just felt completely inadequate. I felt like a total failure, and I felt, I'd been locked up in a psych ward. So when someone said to me, would you like to teach yoga? And the people enjoyed my classes, it was like a lifeline. It was like, fuck, here's something that I can actually do. Here's something that I'm good at. Here's something that people appreciate. And I remember, like, I started to do some classes at a friend's house for friends. It was just like, yeah, $5, you guys just rock up. And like 15 people would show up to this house, and they'd been spilling out of all over the place, and there was no room, and it was pretty extraordinary. And then, and this is 2006, right? So I'm teaching yoga, and I'm not trained, but it began to sort of put me back together in terms of the thing about experiencing mental illness, especially when you end up in a psych ward, or you end up with psychosis, or something I guess you call serious mental illness, as compared to maybe low-level anxiety or depression. There is a lot of stigma, and that stigma is so internalized. Like, there's such internalized shame around it. And one of the major reasons for this is that we tend to identify with our minds. So we think we are our minds. And when we identify with our minds, if our mind breaks, if our mind fucks up, then it's like we are broken, we are fucked up, that there is something extraordinarily wrong with us, which is why it can be so devastating to have experiences of mental illness. Now, fortunately for me, because I'd been doing a significant amount of yoga and meditation, I had already disidentified from the mind as such. Like, I already knew that I wasn't my mind. I was already having experiences of being the witness. And so what that meant was, yes, it was still so devastating to have an experience of psychosis. And I still did feel like there was something, I was afraid. I was afraid that there was something deeply wrong with me. I was afraid that I was deeply, fucked up. And at the same time, I also had an understanding that the experience of psychosis was simply the way that my mind was functioning for various reasons. And because the mind wasn't who I was, that there was a part of me that was actually deeply okay. So there was all of this stuff going on when I began to teach yoga, and it's kind of ironic because I was vulnerable, and I was fragile, and I was so afraid I was a failure. I felt like a failure. I felt completely outside of the mainstream. I felt completely outside of society. But there I was teaching yoga at the forefront of the yoga wave in a way. And it wasn't until 2008 that I finally got some training under my belt when I was up in Wellington. And what was interesting, so I moved to Wellington in beginning of 2008. And when I moved to Wellington, the intention was to get on the career ladder, to get a corporate job, it was like 2008 was about 3.5 years since I'd been in the psych ward. I had been teaching yoga by now for a while, and I was continuing to write as well. Hadn't had any major success with the writing at that stage. But the teaching of the yoga had put me back together in terms of, it made me feel like I had something of value to offer to society. Because that was the big deal, coming back from overseas, etc., and feeling like I was useless, I was worthless, I had nothing of value to offer. And so teaching yoga had begun to give me that sense again that, that I have something of value that I can offer. So when I got to Wellington, I started cruising the jobs, and I managed to land a job as a personal assistant to this guy who was he'd written a shitload of books. He'd written like 20 or 30 books, and he was a trainer, really, a corporate trainer. So he would go in and teach like the art of negotiation, for example. And because training, like being a trainer, was something I had my eyes on, I was like, oh, this will be perfect to be a personal assistant to this guy. So I landed that job and was doing that, but very quickly felt quite isolated because it was just him and I in an office, and I also felt like he was a bit of a sinking ship, actually, like when I looked at the clients that he had and what he was doing. So I was also cruising other jobs, and when I was doing that, I saw a job advertised as a speechwriter for the Ministry of Social Development, writing speeches for the Minister of Social Development, and at that time it was Ruth Dyson. And I was like, fuck yeah, speech writing, because something else I had been doing was I'd been going to Toastmasters, and I had within a very short time completed the first Toastmasters manual where you have to do 10 speeches, etc. And I'd done that in like 6 months or 8 months or something. So because I had done the Toastmasters, because I had done the yoga, I felt like I could apply for this job as a speechwriter. And it was a really good salary. It was like $75,000. And at the time, I had been earning $300 a week. Like, I'd been living on next to nothing, teaching yoga and doing a bit of writing on the side. So I applied for this job as a speechwriter, and it was like serendipity. The woman who interviewed me was my age. Her name was Kim, and she got me. Something about her, she understood me. And what was really interesting was that she really reminded me of my best friend in high school. She carried a similar energetic archetype, like a through line of consciousness. And it was like, she was like this angel that just showed up in my life, and she gave me the job, you know, and I was like, holy shit, I've never worked in an office. I never had a corporate job. I've never worked for the government. I've never done anything like this. I'm 3 years out of the psych ward, and now I'm writing speeches for the Minister of Social Development. Like, what the... and so I did. And what was even better was that it was working from home. So it was a 6-month contract. And I nailed it. Like, I knew how to write speeches because it was just, I was naturally good at that kind of thing. And so that began to increase my confidence a lot in terms of who I was and what I could do and what my talents were like. And then eventually I finally got my yoga teacher training certificate in 2010. I finished it off, went to LA with Shiva Ray. I ended up having that job as a speechwriter for a year and a half, and I was writing for Paula Bennett. Because after Ruth Dyson, of course, the Labour government was voted out. That was 2008. The national government was voted in, and so all of a sudden I found myself writing speeches for national MPs, and that was a really interesting experience. Taught me a lot. And so I guess the reason I'm sharing this is that, why am I sharing this? It felt really important to talk about my journey, because it feels like so many of us experience mental health challenges, and it's fucking hard. You know, it is so hard. There is the external stigma around it, and there's a lot of internal stigma around it. There is the way that the mind can be. My mind was so fragile. My way of interacting with the world was so fragile. Like when I had the psychosis/awakening, it was like all the secrets of the universe were downloaded into my system, and I couldn't handle it, so everything just went and then it had to rebuild. And so what I found was that I had no filters on information. So information would just like pour into me, like lights and sound, and all the data coming through the senses was just too extreme. It was too much, and I couldn't process it, and I couldn't handle it. Plus I had, deep feelings of shame and unworthiness and all of that stuff going on. So in the moment, not being able to cope with the reality because of the amount of information coming in, it just compounded. It all compounded. And I just saw society in a completely different way. I couldn't function in society the way that I had. And I'm so grateful for my yoga practice, because the yoga practice and the yoga framework was what allowed me to completely 100% recover and heal from psychosis and a diagnosis of bipolar. So that was 2004, and I never had another manic episode. I never went into psychosis again. I have experienced depression over the last 14 years, but my framing of depression is that when I experience depression, it is very much a message from my psyche. It is very much my soul speaking to me. So whenever it comes up, I have a way of working with it. Like I turn toward it and I allow myself to go deep into it, and I feel what needs to be felt, what's underneath the depression. And since I started doing that, the periods of depression became less and less and less, and shorter and shorter and shorter. And so it's been a while, maybe a good year or two, since I've experienced depression. And so just to wrap up, I'd say that the number one thing that really helped me to recover from psychosis, there was a part of me that was just like, fuck you all, fuck society, fuck this bullshit, because it's all crap anyway. And I am going to recover in my own fucking way, and I don't believe anything you say, because there's so much bullshit going on that is lied about constantly, like the fact that we're living in a fucking patriarchy and everyone pretends like it's all equal. There was that aspect of me, like this really strong rebel. And so she helped me through immensely. So there was that. And then the second aspect was that I had yoga. Which gave me a framework to interact with reality that was very different from the Western medical model, that gave me the power and the tools and the techniques to recover in a very practical, grounded way from what had happened to my mind. And that realization that I'm not my mind. Not like an intellectual understanding, but I had a knowingness. I knew. There was a moment when I was in the middle of the second episode of Psychosis, and I was in the Pemberton Medical Clinic. And there was a couple of RCMP, a couple of cops standing on the door guarding me, because they thought I might be dangerous. And I knew that something was wrong. I knew I needed to ground. And it was like I was so far away, and I was watching my mind, and my mind was going crazy. It wasn't that I was out of my mind. It was that my mind itself had taken over. But me, my awareness, my perception, that which I truly am, was this little tiny faint, and I was like just connected to it. But it was there. It was there. Even in the middle of the apparent psychosis, that knowingness and anchoring to awareness was there, and that's what got me through. Alrighty, that's enough for this morning. Unless you have any questions, been really beautiful to see those of you who are watching and to feel your love, to see the love hearts coming through. My sense is that potentially we are in, there's so many different ways to view mental illness, and I'm in the midst of finishing off my book right now, my memoir, Field Notes from a Kundalini Awakening, about all this stuff. And so I'm also researching mental health care in New Zealand, and I've just been approached by someone at Massey University who's doing a study on Kundalini Awakening from the psychological perspective, so that they can better understand what people need when they're going through those experiences. So it really does feel like we are at the beginning of a new wave of understanding of the convergence, or the confluence, or the place where spiritual awakening meets mental illness, and starting to understand the differences, the similarities, what it's really all about, and how we can really support each other when we're going through awakenings that look like mental illness. And how do we work with that? How do we work with the mind? All right, big love to you all. My name is Kara-Leah, and that's about it for this morning.